My wife asked me to valet her boyfriend's car. She said it under her breath, like she was asking me to grab napkins off a counter. Like it was normal, like there was nothing strange about saying that to her husband in front of other people. The valet manager was standing right there too, a man who answered to me every Tuesday morning on property calls, and he looked at me, waiting for instructions. I reached into my jacket, handed him my own key instead, told him to keep it somewhere safe, and then I gave her boyfriend the claim ticket and walked back inside the hotel without another word. By that point, I already knew exactly what kind of marriage I was standing in. What Lauren didn't know was that she had just pulled that move at a hotel my family owned, and the brass key in my pocket meant the rest of that story was already moving, whether she understood it or not. A few weeks earlier, I was standing over my father's grave while everybody else was thinking about traffic. My father, Calvin Bellamy, was 71 when he died, and he was the kind of man people described with small words because he never gave them flashy material. Quiet, steady, worked hard, kept to himself, raised me alone after my mother died, wore the same kind of shoes for years, kept a garden behind every house he ever lived in, and never raised his voice. That was the public version of him, and as far as I knew then, it was the full version. I stayed after the funeral because I wasn't ready to move yet, not because I was falling apart, but because that was my father and I needed the silence. I'd already done my crying the night before in my car in a hospital parking garage. The next morning, I still got up, washed my face, made breakfast for my boys, and kept moving, because that's how I was raised. By then, Lauren and I had been married 9 years, and our 7-year-old triplets, Calvin Jr., Bennett, and Miles, were the best part of my life by a mile. Whatever had gone cold between me and their mother, I made sure it never reached them. Lauren was smart, polished, very good at reading a room and deciding how she wanted people to see her. That skill helped her at work in brand strategy, and it also made her dangerous in a marriage, because she knew how to cut without leaving obvious marks. She didn't scream at me or make scenes. She did it with little things. She would correct me in front of people with a smile, act bored before I finished a sentence, or let her eyes slide past me like I was background noise. Over time, I realized she had made a quiet decision about me. In her mind, I had already hit my ceiling. I worked in hotel operations. I drove an older car. I wore the same shirts, and I never talked about money, status, or ambition. To her, that read as ordinary. Then there was Grant Holloway. He started out as a colleague from a real estate project that crossed paths with Lauren's firm, and within a year, he was showing up at our apartment like he belonged there. He always had a reason, always had that smooth, relaxed energy men have when they've never had to wonder if a room was going to accept them. I noticed the inside jokes, the jacket on the chair, the way Lauren's whole face changed when he walked in. I didn't say anything yet because I don't talk just to hear myself talk. I wait until I know what I'm looking at. 3 days after my father's funeral, his attorney called me downtown. Walter Keene wasn't the kind of man who wasted words, so when he told me it was important enough to handle in person, I went. He sat me down, put a sealed envelope on the table, and told me my father had asked him to give it to me after the burial. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting, neat and careful like everything else he ever did. Inside was a brass key and a short letter. The first part said he loved me and was proud of the man I'd become, not because of what I had achieved, but because of how I carried myself when nobody was watching. The second part changed everything I thought I knew about him. My father had quietly built Bellamy Hospitality Group over 3 decades, 14 properties across 6 states, all hidden behind trusts, holding companies, and legal structures so private that almost nobody had the full picture. The valuation was just under $2 billion, and when he died, all of it transferred to me. I read the letter twice, folded it back up, and asked Walter one question. Does anyone else know? He told me no, not completely. I put the brass key in my pocket, thanked him, and drove straight to the downtown flagship hotel I had been helping manage for 4 years under a subsidiary title. I sat in the garage staring at the service entrance I'd walked through 1,000 times, knowing that my last name had been on the building the whole time, and I had never once needed to say it out loud. For the next 6 weeks, I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't confront Lauren. I didn't start throwing accusations around, and I didn't suddenly become a different man because I had a brass key in my pocket and a legal empire tied to my last name. I went to work, I came home, I helped my boys with homework, and I met Walter Keene early on Tuesday mornings to learn what my father had actually built. That quiet routine fooled people, especially Lauren, because people often mistake silence for weakness when really it's just discipline. While she was getting more careless, I was getting clearer. And once I started paying attention with the full picture in mind, I realized Grant wasn't just hanging around because he liked my wife. He asked too many questions for a man who was supposedly just being social. He asked about acquisition trends in hospitality, about how certain hotel groups kept ownership private, about holding structures and layered entities, all in that casual, polished tone people use when they're pretending curiosity is harmless. One night at our kitchen counter, with a drink in his hand and my jacket still on because I had just gotten home, he mentioned Bellamy Hospitality Group like it was some mystery portfolio he'd heard about in the market. He said it had stayed unusually private for a company of that size, and asked if I'd ever come across the name in operations. I told him I had. Then I went quiet and let him keep talking, because I wanted to hear how far he'd go when he thought he was the smartest man in the room. Around the same time, Lauren stopped even pretending to protect appearances. At the boys' fall school showcase, she showed up with Grant, stood beside him like they were the unit, and when another parent smiled at him and said, "You must be so proud of your boys," Lauren just smiled back and said thank you. She didn't correct her. She didn't look for me. She let it sit there in the air while I stood near the back, watching my sons give their presentation, and realizing that my wife was not just drifting away from me. She was editing me out in public, one small scene at a time. That was the part people outside a marriage never understand. The real damage usually doesn't come from one giant moment. It comes from repeated little humiliations that are just subtle enough to deny later. A look, a comment, an omission, a joke with a blade hidden inside it. Lauren was good at that. She knew how to shape a room so that by the time anyone noticed what was happening, the story had already been arranged in her favor. I said nothing because by then I was learning more than I let on. I was learning which properties were mine, which staff had known me only as an operational consultant, which legal structures protected everything my father had left me, and how carefully he had built it so that visible wealth never had to do the talking. I also learned that the Langford, the luxury hotel Lauren picked for our 9th anniversary dinner, was one of ours. She told me she chose it because it was the kind of place you went when you wanted an evening to mean something. I told her that sounded good, and I never mentioned that I had been in that building dozens of times through service corridors and management offices while she was busy imagining it as some world I could never belong to. By the time I arrived that night, Lauren and Grant were already there, and the whole setup told me exactly what kind of evening she intended to have. 6 couples from her circle, good wine already open, the seating arranged in a way that made Grant feel central and me feel optional. He held court the whole night without looking like he was trying, and Lauren lit up beside him in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. Then, right in the middle of dinner, she made a comment about how hard it can be to build a life with someone whose ambition never quite catches up to their potential. She said it lightly enough that nobody had to admit what she meant, and Grant followed it by saying some men are only meant for certain seasons of a woman's life. The table gave that careful social laugh people use when they know something ugly just happened, but don't want the responsibility of naming it. I didn't rise to it. I looked around the room instead, at the staff, the lighting, the architecture, the floor manager who recognized me and looked away because she didn't know which version of me she was allowed to acknowledge in front of my wife and her guests. That dinner ended outside in the cool air with valets bringing cars around, and Lauren stepped close to me and quietly asked me to handle the valet situation for Grant's car like it was the most natural request in the world. Gerald was the valet manager on duty that night, and he had been with the company for years. He knew my voice from early morning operations calls long before he ever knew my face well. And when Lauren made that little request about Grant's car, Gerald looked straight at me and waited. I reached into my jacket and felt the brass key before I pulled it out. By then, I had gotten used to carrying it. It had weight, but it didn't feel strange anymore. I handed it to Gerald and said, "Put this somewhere safe for me." He took it with both hands, not like a valet key, but like something he understood mattered. Then I took the claim ticket from his other hand, turned to Grant, and held it out to him. "You'll want to keep this." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at Lauren for long. I just gave him the ticket and walked back inside, leaving all three of them standing there with whatever story they wanted to tell themselves about what had just happened. I went to the bar and sat down. The bartender set my usual drink in front of me without asking, which told me he recognized me the same way staff across the properties had been trained to. Not publicly, not theatrically, just correctly. I sat there for a while and looked around the room. I looked at the ceiling details, the woodwork, the lighting, the things guests notice when they think luxury appears out of nowhere. My grandfather had sketched the original vision. My father had spent decades turning it into something real, and he had done it without ever needing to stand in a room like that and announce himself. That mattered to me more now than it had before. Lauren thought the insult outside was about status. To her, asking me to deal with Grant's car was a way of putting me in my place. What she still didn't understand was that I had never needed the room to rank me correctly. The room already belonged to my family. I finished my drink, thanked the bartender, and went home because my sons were what actually mattered to me that night. A little over a week later, Walter called me into his office and handed me a formal letter of intent from an acquisition group trying to buy Bellamy Hospitality. It was well built, serious, and careful, the kind of offer that comes from people who have already done a lot of homework before they show their hand. I read every page, asked Walter a couple of questions about how the offer had been structured, and then I dictated the response. One paragraph, clean and final. The offer was declined. Bellamy Hospitality was not for sale. No explanation, no meeting, no invitation to negotiate. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the moment Grant finally stepped on the wrong wire. He pushed for the name of the controlling trustee through public filings tied to the response, and by the end of that Friday, he had it. Adrian Bellamy, my full legal name, my address, just enough documentation to confirm that the husband he had been casually disrespecting in my own home was the sole controlling trustee of the company he had been trying to get access to through business channels, and whether he admitted it or not, through my wife. He went to Lauren the next day with the documents on his phone. I wasn't there, but I know what happened because by then, the sequence was obvious, and later I heard enough to understand the room. He sat down, showed her the trust filings, the property list, the rejection letter with my name on it, and let her look at it until the meaning settled in. 14 hotels, 6 states, the Langford, the same place where she had humiliated me in front of her friends, thinking I was just some quiet operations guy who didn't have the reach to embarrass her back. Suddenly, every small detail from that dinner changed shape in her mind. The bartender pouring my drink before I ordered. Gerald taking my brass key with both hands. The floor manager who caught my eye and looked away. The staff moving around me with that slight difference she noticed, but never understood. And worst of all for her, I had never lied to create any of it. I had simply never explained myself to someone who never really wanted to know me. By the time Grant left her apartment that day, Lauren was sitting at her table, staring at the screen, and finally seeing the full size of the man she had spent years talking down to. Grant didn't make a scene when he left Lauren's apartment. That would have required him to care about the relationship more than the deal he thought he was moving toward. And by then, she finally understood that he didn't. He didn't yell, didn't defend himself, didn't try to explain how it looked. He just became efficient. His calls got shorter over the next few days, then less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. Lauren was good at reading people, and once she had the right information, she read in clearly. Whatever he had seen in her was never fully separate from what he thought being close to her might eventually give him access to. Once that door closed, so did his interest. That kind of realization lands harder when the person walking away isn't even cruel about it. It means they were never emotionally invested enough to bother with cruelty in the first place. While all of that was unfolding on her side, I kept my schedule. I went to Bennett's soccer practice on Saturday morning, met Walter on Tuesday before sunrise, approved a renovation proposal for one of our Birmingham properties, and ate lunch alone on Wednesday at the same place near the office that always made good oxtail. I didn't call Lauren to ask what Grant had done, and I didn't send any messages designed to let her know I knew what was happening. There was nothing to gain from that. The truth was already doing its job without my help. My father had spent his life building systems that moved correctly without noise, and I trusted that. More importantly, I had 3 boys watching how I handled pressure even when they didn't know that was what they were seeing. I wasn't interested in revenge, and I had no appetite for messy drama. What mattered to me was stability, clarity, and the next right decision. Lauren finally asked for the conversation on a Tuesday morning after the boys had gone to school. It was one of those gray Atlanta mornings where the sky looks undecided and the kitchen light feels flatter than usual. I came in from my meeting and found coffee already poured at the table, 2 cups waiting. She had clearly been sitting there a while. When I sat down, she looked at me differently than she had in months. Not warmly, and not with the old impatience either. It was the look of someone trying to rearrange a whole mental picture of another person in real time. Then she asked, "How long did you know?" She wasn't only asking about Grant. She was asking how long I had known what she was doing, how long I had known what my father had left me, how long I had been sitting inside a truth she had completely missed. I let the question sit there for a second because it deserved a real answer, but not a dramatic one. Then I said, "Long enough." That was all I gave her, and it was enough. From there, the marriage moved into its final form with less noise than most people would probably expect. We both knew the performance was over. There wasn't much left to fight about emotionally because the emotional part had already died before the legal part ever started. The question now was how to handle the end without turning it into collateral damage for the boys. Lauren understood that I wasn't going to scream, and I understood that she wasn't going to confess her way into making this cleaner than it was. What sat between us at that table was not passion anymore. It was consequence. She had spent years treating me like a man too small to matter in the room she valued most. And now she had to sit across from me and accept that I had seen all of it without once lowering myself to compete for her respect. By the time we stood up from that table, the marriage wasn't hanging on by a thread. It was over, and all that remained was to decide whether we were going to end it like reckless people or like parents. The divorce went through attorneys, which was exactly how I wanted it. No shouting in hallways, no public accusations, no ugly back and forth designed to make either one of us feel like we'd won something worth having. Walter brought in the right people on my side, and they were precise. The trust structure my father built had been designed to survive pressure, bad incentives, and other people's assumptions. So what belonged to him stayed protected the way he intended. There were angles my legal team could have taken that would have left Lauren with much less, especially once the timeline around Grant and the marriage was clear, but I told them not to build the case that way. I wasn't interested in using hidden leverage to punish her. I was interested in making sure my boys had stability when the paperwork was done, and that when they looked back years later, they wouldn't find a trail of bitterness where a father should have had more control than that. So that became the center of every decision. The boys stayed in their school. Their routines stayed clean. Their time with Lauren stayed secure, and my time with them was protected in a way that couldn't be casually rearranged later because somebody got emotional or resentful. We worked out summers, holidays, transportation, education, and all the practical things that children feel immediately, even when adults pretend they don't. I made sure the home they knew with their mother remained intact because I was not going to let their world collapse just because my marriage had. That mattered more to me than extracting some legal victory I could brag about to people I didn't respect. Lauren saw that too. I think part of what unsettled her most by then was realizing that even with every advantage on paper, I still wasn't trying to crush her. I was simply refusing to become small just because she had misjudged me for years. What I also refused to do was run a public campaign about what happened. I didn't call her family. I didn't start correcting mutual friends. I didn't go around explaining that Grant had been more interested in access than love, or that Lauren had spent years managing the image of our marriage while privately cutting pieces out of it. People heard whatever version they heard. Some probably guessed more than they said. Some likely built their own story out of fragments and timing and the way people suddenly stop appearing together. That was fine with me. I had never been a man who needed the room to tell my story accurately in order for me to know I was standing in the truth. If someone asked, I kept it simple. We were divorcing. The boys were doing well. We were handling it privately. That was enough. And the more I held the line there, the more the noise died on its own. Lauren changed after that, though not in some dramatic movie way. It was smaller and harder to describe, which is probably why it felt real. She was quieter with me, more careful, not because she thought she could undo what she had done, but because the old tone no longer fit. The little public corrections disappeared. The sideways glances disappeared. The casual assumption that I would accept whatever role she assigned me also disappeared. She had spent years reading me as a limited man with a narrow life, and now she had to live with the fact that I had seen her clearly, while she had failed to see me at all. One evening when I picked the boys up, Calvin Jr. ran ahead to the car. Bennett was talking about something from school, and Miles stayed close to my side like he always did in transition moments. Lauren stood at the door for an extra second and looked at me like she wanted to ask a question bigger than anything either of us had the right to ask anymore. She didn't say it, and I didn't help her. Some answers come too late to be useful. By January, the cold had finally settled in for real, and the paperwork was done. The house was quiet in that new way a life gets quiet after a long, unresolved thing has finally been decided. I woke up one Saturday morning, looked at my 3 boys eating breakfast in pajamas and arguing about syrup, and I knew there was one place I wanted to take them. Not the service entrance, not the back offices, the front doors, the brass handles, the marble floor, the version of the story my father never bothered to perform for anybody else. I wanted them to see what belonged to them, and I wanted them to hear it from me the right way the first time. That Saturday, I took the boys downtown and brought them in through the front entrance of the flagship instead of the service side. They noticed the doors first, those heavy brass handles that felt important the second their hands touched them. Then they stepped into the lobby and all 3 of them went quiet, in that way kids do when they walk into a space bigger than what they expected. Not scared, just recalculating. Calvin Jr. turned in a slow circle on the marble floor, looking up at the ceiling, the chandeliers, the trim, the front desk, all of it. Bennett wandered toward a display case near the concierge desk because he was curious about everything, and Miles stayed close enough that his shoulder kept brushing my arm. Then Calvin looked at me and asked the question exactly the way a 7-year-old asks something huge without realizing how huge it is. "Dad, is this yours?" I looked at all 3 of them and said, "It's ours. Your great-grandfather started it. Your grandfather built it bigger. One day you'll understand what that means." What I wanted them to understand wasn't just that the hotel belonged to our family. I wanted them to understand what my father had really left behind. He hadn't spent his life building a business so somebody could feel important walking through a lobby. He built it carefully, quietly, and in a way that could outlast ego. Standing there with my sons, I realized that was the real inheritance. Not the properties, not the valuation, not the private structures or the legal protections. It was the standard. The expectation that if something of weight ever lands in your hands, you carry it with discipline. You don't use it to show off, and you don't use it to settle petty scores. You use it correctly. I let the boys explore the lobby, asked one of the managers to bring them hot chocolate, and watched them take the place in without any of the social baggage adults attached to money. To them, it was just a beautiful building connected to their family. That simplicity made me want even more to protect the kind of men they would become. A couple of weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, I went back to my father's grave alone. The boys were with Lauren. The weather was cold enough to matter, and the sky looked heavy even though it still hadn't committed to rain. I stood there the same way I had after the funeral, hands in my coat pockets, looking at his name and giving the moment the time it needed. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out the brass key. I had carried it every day since Walter handed it to me, and at some point it stopped feeling like an object and started feeling like part of the responsibility itself. I held it for a minute, thinking about my father's garden, his shoes, his steady habits, and the fact that he built something enormous without ever needing applause from people who hadn't earned the right to speak on it. Then I set the key on top of the headstone and left it there. I didn't need to carry it anymore because by then I understood what it had been for. It didn't turn me into somebody new. It confirmed who I already was before I knew what was waiting for me. And that, honestly, was the part that stayed with me the most. Lauren thought the story was about status, and Grant thought it was about access, but neither one of them understood the real thing sitting in front of them. This was never about whether I could prove I mattered in a room full of people who ranked men by noise, money signals, and social performance. It was about whether I could take betrayal, power, and the chance to humiliate somebody back and still make the right decisions when nobody would have blamed me for doing otherwise. I protected my boys. I ended the marriage without turning it into a circus. I kept what my father built intact, and I walked away from all of it knowing I never had to announce myself for the truth to hold. That was enough for me then, and it's enough for me now. If this story hit you, I'd appreciate it if you liked the video, shared it with somebody who'd get something out of it, and subscribed for more stories like this. I always want these to feel real, honest, and worth your time. I'm curious what stood out to you most here. When do you think the real betrayal became impossible to ignore? Do you think I handled Lauren and Grant the right way? Or would you have confronted them much earlier? And what do you think matters more in the end? Exposing people publicly, or just making sure the consequences land where they need to?